right. Hey, everybody. Oh, let me get that adjusted. Let's definitely make sure everything is working. I am still working out the frequent audio issues that I have. Everything sound good? Don't see anyone in the chat. So looks like things are working on my end. All right, I am going to operate under the assumption things are working. All right, so today I am picking up where I left off last week, which is talking about this problem of generalizing from the armchair. And last week I just went into a whole range of different metaphilosophical topics, and it really does seem like that's the direction I drift when I let myself go in these live streams and just talk about whatever comes to my mind. So the first thing I should say is welcome everyone. I'm glad that people are here. It usually takes a little while for people to start trickling in. So people that watch this later, you could probably skip ahead. And one thing I'll ask people to do, or maybe I should go back and do it myself. But if anyone notices, when I get started on the content for the video and I get past the introductory stuff, I'm happy to, especially if someone leaves it in the comments, I could pin it or whatever, but make a note of that, the starting point in the video. I could also just edit these to skip past the initial stuff, but I don't know. I kind of like having this be a live stream, like kind of the way that it is. Okay. Hi, Andy. Andy, you can hear me okay, right? This is working. I had a couple times because I've only been doing this for a few months. I'm not like a veteran of YouTubing. I haven't been doing this for a long time. So, sometimes I goof things up, that sort of thing. Okay, there's no confirmation that people could hear me. So if there's a problem, I don't know. Okay, cool. You can hear me. Great. All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Okay, so anyway, so to clear up some like, I don't know, general announcements and that sort of thing. All right, so if you're new to my channel, welcome. This channel is Lance Independent, and I'll just go over some preliminary stuff. It's a take on, it's a combination of my name and a reference to the notion of stance independence, which is a common way that moral realism is defined these days, that it's defined as the claim that there are stance independent moral facts. So that's a technical term. It just means that there are moral facts that are true independent of the goals or standards or values of any individuals or groups. These facts are out there, so to speak, and are true in a way that isn't made true by our attitudes or our preferences. So this channel, part of what motivated me to create this channel is that I think that moral realism is not a very defensible philosophical position. And just in spite of that, the recent surveys from Phil Paper showed that 62% of the survey respondents, which are professional philosophers, endorsed moral realism, while only about a quarter endorsed moral anti-realism. The remainder picked a variety of positions. And, you could take that as this is some indication that moral realism is true. After all, the experts endorse moral realism. But I don't think that that's the case. I think that moral realism, I don't think that there is a single good argument for moral realism, not one. And so one of the things you'll commonly find when people engage in philosophical discussions and debates, especially in academic contexts, is people will say, look, I disagree with the position, but there's good arguments for it. And this may very well be true of quite a lot of philosophical positions that I don't endorse. It's not the case of moral realism. So I don't think there are any good arguments. And so, of course I could be wrong about that. Maybe there are good arguments, in the sense of arguments that ought to compel like a reasonable person that's capable of carefully evaluating the evidence or persuasiveness of the propositions or the whatever it is that's being presented in favor of the view in question. Of course I could be wrong about that. If I'm not, I think that this might point to a deeper methodological problem in academic philosophy, and more particularly the area of philosophy that I've been trained in, which is analytic philosophy. So if that's the case, I think, and this has increasingly pushed me towards, I think that is the case. And it's increasingly pushed me towards basically critical views that take on the metaphilosophical, and you could say methodological presuppositions implicit in analytic philosophy. So analytic philosophy is a particular approach to philosophy. There's a sort of schism between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is more associated with the UK, the United States, and though it's like a different branch or different area of Western philosophy compared to continental philosophy is more associated with France and Germany. We don't need, it's not a history lesson. I'm not a historian of philosophy, so I shouldn't even be getting into that too much. But just the point is that this is a specific area of philosophy. There are there's continental and other types of philosophy too. I'm particularly critical of this method, not necessarily because it's most worthy of criticism, but because it's the one I'm most familiar with. And that's basically the only reason. This is the area of philosophy that I work in. I also do psychology, and I kind of take this interdisciplinary approach to a lot of these questions, where I combine philosophy and psychology, and I approach a lot of the psychological stuff that I do from a philosophical perspective, and vice versa, where there's a heavy dose of psychology in the way that I approach philosophy. And for me, I see the disciplines as very intertwined, or at least I think that they ought to be intertwined, because philosophers are using a particular toolkit, the mind. And the mind is the subject of study of psychology. So you could see psychology as kind of like it's studying the output or the function of the human brain. It's not, psychology is not exactly the same thing as like neuroscience or neuroanatomy. It's not like psychologists, I don't have a bunch of training in like brain anatomy or something like that. We study what the brain does. And philosophy's like basically its output, like the systems that are used to do philosophy is the mind. And so from my perspective, that from the outset, if you want to do philosophy well, it seems really, really important to understand how the tools that we're doing philosophy with work. And part of what frustrates me about contemporary analytic philosophy, this is analytic philosophy in the past few decades, basically, is that there have been philosophers that are very on board with the importance of psychology. Quine would be an example. There's experimental philosophers. There's philosophers that are really interested in the importance of cognitive science. There are Josh Green would be a great example of a philosopher that thinks psychology and cognitive neuroscience and basically empirical sciences are deeply important to addressing philosophical questions. So there are philosophers that have this approach. I want there to be more of them. I don't think it should be this thing where it's like maybe 10% of philosophers, maybe less, 5% care about the empirical findings. And then you have a big contingent of philosophers that might say, yeah, it's probably relevant, not what I do. Not everybody has to be hostile to everything that I think is important. They could just be like, not what I do, I don't care. And then there are some philosophers that are very dismissive of the importance of psychology to philosophy. What I should say about that is often that dismissiveness is motivated by objections to overstated claims about the potential of empirical findings. So, one of the things over the past 20 years, it's kind of this movement in philosophy is experimental philosophy. So basically experimental philosophy takes traditionally philosophical questions, and then you employ empirical methods to address them, typically the tools of psychology. Often it would be something like social psychological paradigms, but it doesn't have to be. Green is an example of someone doing neuroscience to inform philosophical questions. So experimental philosophy is basically just using empirical findings in conjunction with addressing traditionally philosophical questions. Now, the reason I say traditionally philosophical questions is because these questions at some point may become so intertwined with the empirical sciences that, from particular points of view, it might not be clear that the particular researchers studying the issue are dealing with an issue that at the very least used to be a part of philosophy. On the other hand, the case could be made that everything used to be part of philosophy, like all the natural sciences, branched out of people where these disciplinary divisions were not as sharp as they are now. Anyway, so I work in this area, this interdisciplinary research area between philosophy and psychology. For some of you that have been here for a while, you probably already heard this 1,000 times, so I won't get into it too much. So let me pick up where I left off last week. Last week, I had wanted to get into what I think is a very important issue in the underlying methodology of many contemporary analytic philosophers, which is this appeal to their intuitions. Now, one of the things many critics of this approach might critique, is the reliability of intuitions. They might say intuitions are not a good source of evidence, or they might argue we shouldn't use intuitions, or they might argue that there are various sorts of biasing influences that undermine this or that philosophical approach. And I think there might be merit to, one moment. My phone keeps wanting to make noise while I'm talking. So just turn it off. Anyway, so there's a lot of these criticisms that go after the reliability or basically and then another approach goes after whether philosophers use intuitions at all. So there's been a few philosophers that have argued, hey, it's not really part of the method of philosophy to rely on intuitions. So there's been those sorts of critiques, but that's not really the approach that I tend to take towards this question. It's not, and I think those questions are all worth addressing, but often a big focus for me are questions that I don't think are asked and challenges that aren't raised as often as I think that they should be. So last week I was going to talk about this. I pinned the blog post that goes with this. So I do have a blog. It's also called Lance Independent. You could go check that out. I actually started the blog before I started the channel, and a lot of my videos have basically been a sort of a live kind of impromptu cover. It's improvised cover of what's the content of one of the blog posts, and then I'll just go off of that and talk about whatever comes to mind. But a lot of times those blog posts are pretty short. Sometimes they're a bit longer, and sometimes I've read through them. This one is a bit on the longer side. I'd say it's medium long length, but it really is, I think, worth a read if you want to get a sense of what I'm going to be talking about today. But if you don't want to check it out, that's why I do the videos too, so I could talk about what's in there. Okay, so generalizing from the armchair. I was going to get into talking about it last week. I'm already 12 minutes in and I haven't even started talking about it. So let me get into it this week. Here's what the issue is. So the issue is that philosophers will frequently make claims like X is intuitive, or this seems to be true, or we think that. So you'll notice all of this terminology that philosophers will use. They'll talk about we or us, or they'll make various claims that are referring to some nebulous population of, it's unspecified who they're talking about. They'll also say that something is intuitive. Now notice something about this sort of language. It doesn't specify who they're talking about. And so a common refrain you'll hear from me when philosophers will say, moral anti-realism is counterintuitive. Counterintuitive to who? So I take questions about whether something seems to be true, or is intuitive, or appears to be the case, or is plausible. Those don't strike me as intrinsic properties of the propositional claims in question. Rather, they strike me as relational claims about the stance one could take in principle towards the claims in question. Now, of course, given a bunch of reasonable presuppositions that I almost certainly share with most philosophers and most non-philosophers, certain sorts of claims might seem to be more plausible, or appear to be true, or be more obvious, or be more intuitive, that sort of thing. For example, it seems to me that I don't know, the Earth is bigger than my hand. Like how would that not be the case? That seems obvious, seems true. So of course there are like skeptical philosophical positions that would challenge this or any other claim, in principle that someone could make. But that's, you could say that's a reasonable starting point, that we all agree that this seems true. Now, I haven't gone out and done a survey and asked people whether they would think that, like, for instance, a baseball is smaller than the Earth. But I would imagine if you ask people that, most people would say, yeah, it's smaller than the Earth. You are going to get a few people that wouldn't say that. Probably a lot of those people are joking around or misinterpret a question. That seems more plausible than them having a weird view about like physics or mass or something. But you might get some people that sincerely believe, like, I don't know, there are no size differences between objects, or objects don't exist. So the question would make sense, or they would have a weird view about it, something like that. But in general, the sorts of claims that philosophers make, they don't specify who they're talking about. So they'll just say it is intuitive that such and such is the case. Now, the issue with that is that that is a psychological claim. And so while some psychological claims, some claims about how people think, what seems to be true to people, are so plausible that I don't know that we really need to go out and do the research. Like, we don't need to do research to find out that most people would prefer eating bread over eating, garbage. We don't need to do research for that. But philosophers aren't merely making claims that are like trivial or platitudinous. They make claims where they are subject to legitimate challenge about whether or not the claim in question is even true. And part of the problem is often that the claims are so underspecified, it's difficult to even know how to evaluate them. What I find puzzling about what philosophers are doing when they make these sorts of claims is there doesn't seem to be any explicit or even implicit recognition that people could vary with respect to the matter in question. But even when they do acknowledge this, which they often do, not philosophers, it'd be very strange to find a philosopher that would say literally 100% of all humans that have ever existed find moral realism intuitive, and none of them find it counterintuitive, or none of them find anti-realism intuitive. But then you have to get into like these more complicated questions, which is if the population is composed of people that both do find something intuitive or don't find it intuitive, or do find it intuitive or find it counterintuitive, we now need an explanation for that. You're going to need some, if you think that the intuitions are an indication of what's true, you're going to need some account of error. And that account might require some sort of psychological description of what's going wrong with the people that have the intuitions that you don't think are correct, or that don't have the intuitions you think are correct. So I want to stop there to draw a distinction there. It's often difficult when I discuss these issues. Someone might say moral realism is intuitive, or they might more typically, instead of just saying moral realism is intuitive, they would take some example moral claims like murder is wrong, and then say it's intuitive that is wrong in a sense consistent with realism, or a sense indicative of realism. It stands independently wrong. So they don't typically jump straight to realism. They'll take some claim, and then the claim would be true in a sense that would only be true if realism were true. I don't think that is a practical difference. I don't think that difference makes much of a practical difference. But sometimes people go, I'm not saying moral realism is intuitive. I'm saying it's wrong to torture babies. That statement is true is intuitive. And that is true in the realist sense. Okay, well, then you think realism is intuitive, whatever. We could be pedantic if we want. I don't, if I were leveraging the claim that realism is intuitive for some rhetorical purpose that was misrepresenting what realists think, then I would be more careful about the language. But I don't think I'd typically do that. And I haven't really seen anybody do that. So I don't know why people nitpick on that particular issue, but they do. In any case, so part of the issue here is that there's often a lack of specificity about what's being asserted. And then if you challenge that, philosophers might then acknowledge, okay, fine, I'm not saying everyone finds it intuitive, but if you don't have this intuition, I wanted to draw a distinction. So there's a distinction between having the intuition that something is true versus having the intuition that it's false, and having the intuition that it's true or false, and then not having an intuition at all. Those are two different scenarios. So when it comes to the question of like, I don't know, like a Gettier case or something like that, various sorts of philosophical intuitions, it's often a case that like, I'm not entirely sure what people are reporting when they say that they have intuitions. I don't know quite what they mean. So intuition, as it's used in philosophy, is a philosophical term of art. It is not used in a colloquial sense to refer to like a hunch or a feeling that something is true that you're not sure where it's coming from. It's very difficult to define intuition in the philosophical sense, but often philosophers will emphasize a couple distinctions. So one is they may draw a distinction between pre-theoretical intuitions and reflective intuitions. So a pre-theoretical intuition is something like a disposition or tendency or inclination to hold a particular philosophical position prior to having substantial exposure to formal philosophical training, education, thoughts, ideas, discussion, that sort of thing. So this would be like, pre-theoretically, we might suppose that people believe in an external world. That is, people that have no formal training in philosophy do tend to think that there is an external world. And we might think, for instance, that pre-theoretically, people are intuitive dualists. So the substance dualists, you could say, that pre-theoretically, prior to exposure to philosophy, people have a tendency to construe the world in terms of physical stuff and mental stuff. But that is distinct from reflective intuition. So reflective intuition would be an intuition, typically one that is developed by engaging sufficiently with philosophy to have reflected on the question at hand and to have developed a position on the matter. And it could be that once you think through the issue clearly, you tend to form or develop, either form intuitions or develop a capacity for having intuitions in response to considerations of various hypothetical scenarios, cases, that sort of thing, where now you sort of have a trained capacity for having intuitions that is honed by the ability to respond in a more potentially accurate or truth-tracking sort of way. So you could call them kind of it's kind of like lay judgment versus expert judgment, something like that. That's not a perfect distinction, but that's one distinction. There's other sorts of distinctions that you can make with intuitions. People define them in different sorts of ways, but often what philosophers will say is that intuitions are a type of intellectual seeming. Now, the seeming element of that characterization captures a kind of phenomenology or subjective qualitative experience associated with an intuition. And the intellectual element of it captures that it's something that is about entertaining like propositions. It's something that is about entertaining facts about the world. They're intellectual considerations rather than some sort of like raw sensorial experience. So an intuition is something like a disposition to regard as true some sort of propositional claim. It's not you don't have an intuition of redness or the taste of chocolate or something like that. So those are phenomenological states. Those are experiential states, but they're not intellectual. You know, when I see a tree in the distance, that's not an intellectual. Like if I said, it seems there's a tree over there, that's not an intellectual seeming. That's a visual seeming. And then there you have the other sensory seemings as well. An intellectual seeming would be a seeming about some, you know, like a deductive argument, and you're evaluating it, and you go, the premise 2 seems true to me, you know, something like that. So that's very roughly how a lot of philosophers use them. There's you know, disputes over how exactly to characterize intuitions. So part of the issue for me is that I don't really seem to have, I said seem, in the context of describing this, which is a little interesting, but I don't often have these intuitions. Like I don't know that I have intuitions as a distinct type of psychological state. A lot of times when I'm presented with a thought experiment, it's not like when I hear a thought experiment, you give me a thought experiment, what do you think you should do? It's not like I go, and then some unconscious, like some disposition to judge one way or the other emerges from the phenomenological void, enters my consciousness and delivers an answer. To me, that seems like what a lot of philosophers are describing as the experience they have when considering thought experiments or various sorts of cases. You give someone a trolley problem and you say, oh, like the switch case in the trolley problem. So the train headed down the tracks, it's going to hit 5 people if you don't pull the switch. If you do pull the switch, it'll divert it onto an off track and where it'll hit 1 person instead. And then the question is, what should you do or what would be permissible to do? There's various ways of framing the question. Like the morally good or permissible decision, would it be permissible, for instance, to pull the switch? Most people say that it is when they've conducted empirical studies on this. I think most philosophers agree. Most people think it's permissible or obligatory to pull the switch to kill 1 person instead of killing 5 people. So my reaction to that is I don't have an intuition. Like I do have a judgment about it. I would say, yeah, you should pull the switch. I think it's permissible to pull the switch, and minimizing deaths seems good to me in a certain sort of sense. But when I say it seems good to me, that doesn't strike me as an intellectual seeming. Like the experience that I have of that isn't some strange and mysterious bubbling up out of some unknown location sense of truth. It's more that I would think that that's the good thing to do. It's very similar to like if I eat a piece of food and someone says like, is this good? Like, does it taste good? I don't sit there and go, do I have the experience that it's true that it's good? Where like I'm judging a proposition. It's like, yeah, I'm having a positive experience as I'm tasting the food. So like if you said, is it true that you're having a positive experience? Yes. Is it true that you're enjoying the taste of the food? Yes. But it's not intellectual. And I have a similar reaction to a lot of these cases where my reaction to them either doesn't have this, I don't know if there's anything distinctively intellectual about it. And also, in a lot of cases, I don't have a sense that there's something true about it, in the sense that like it seems like philosophers are treating the intuition like you give them a case and then they have a feeling about the truth and then they're correct about that. A lot of times when I'm given these cases, I could tell you like what I would do or how I would react to it. But a lot of times it's just like, yeah, that's my belief about the matter. So, if you ask me, like, to give an example, a lot of them feel like this. If someone says, hey, is the Statue of Liberty in Australia? No, it's not in Australia. But I don't have like a feeling that it's in Australia. I don't have an intellectual seeming. I'm just like extracting semantic knowledge or something like that. So, a lot of times I'm just recalling my views about the world or my memories, my beliefs. I'm consulting what I already am disposed to think. And there's nothing, it doesn't have this distinctive, like sui generis feel to it that a lot of philosophers seem to be using when describing philosophical intuitions, as though they're a special kind of psychological state. So, I don't even know if I have those. In any case, so that is one distinction, the distinction between having a philosophical intuition versus not having one at all, and having a contrary intuition. And this could put me at a sort of dialectical or argumentative disadvantage when arguing, for instance, with moral realists, because the realist can say, I have intuitions that support realism. Do you have intuitions that support anti-realism? And in a certain sense, if we're careful to be clear about the phenomena, like it depends what you mean by an intuition. If you mean, do I think that I have distinctive types of psychological states where when I'm presented with cases like sentences like, it is morally wrong to torture babies for fun, that I have I don't have it's not just that I don't have the intuition that that's true. Let me start over with that. Okay, so I want to be precise about the language. Someone presents you this case. Do you think it is stance independently wrong to torture babies for fun? And then the realist will say, yeah, and they might have the intuition that that proposition is true. Now, I do think it's wrong, but I don't think it's stance independently wrong. So that already creates one difficulty for me, which is this issue of normative entanglement, which I've talked about in previous videos. And basically that's the problem of there being this conflation between an anti-realist saying that they don't think something is wrong in the sense realists do, and the anti-realist saying they don't think it's wrong in any meaningful respect. And often what moral realists will do in disputes or when they're framing or discussing moral realism and anti-realism is they will give the implication that the anti-realist doesn't disapprove of baby torture, or they don't care, or they're indifferent to it, or they're more likely to torture babies, or they are a terrible person, they have bad moral character. They'll imply these sorts of things by using language in a way that's ambiguous and underspecified, or at the very least that could give the pragmatic implication that the anti-realist is committed to something they're not. Anyway, setting aside that issue, if you very carefully work out what exactly you're saying, do you think that such and such a claim, it's stance independent, there's a stance independent moral fact such that it's wrong in that respect? It's not that I have the intuition that that's false, technically speaking. I don't have a seeming at all about this. I don't have that seeming, but I don't have any seemings. That's not how I consider these sorts of cases. I don't know that I have those kinds of psychological states. And I don't think that philosophers have been especially clear on what kinds of psychological states they're talking about. Is this a distinct type of psychological state? Do we have a worked out empirical research in cognitive science that shows that distinctive regions of the brain are activated and these are a distinct type of mental state? If the answer is yes, the answer is not yes, as far as I know. I don't think anyone's done that research. So if the answer is no, how do we know that there's a distinct type of psychological state? And if philosophers aren't saying there's a distinct type of psychological state, then what are they saying? If there isn't a distinct philosophical intuition, if that's not a type of judgment which could figure into our best cognitive scientific theories, then what is going on? Are there different psychological mechanisms producing different types of intuitions, and we're just using one term to refer to all of those? Because if that's the case, then when different people are reporting different philosophical intuitions, they're not even necessarily talking about the same types of psychological states. And if they're not talking about the same types of psychological states because they are produced by different psychological mechanisms, well, we can't just presume that if one type of philosophical, like let's say the idea of a philosophical intuition actually breaks down into 6 or 7 different types of psychological states. What if some of those states are the result of reliable cognitive processes and some aren't? What if some of them tend to give us true beliefs and some don't? I don't even know. So I think that there is a deep underspecificity psychologically in what's even being asserted when we talk about intuitions. Okay, so having set all that aside, we have this problem that when philosophers talk about this sort of subject, they will say things like, it's intuitive that, it seems that, and as I've said, they don't specify who they're talking about. Now, one thing that philosophers might think is that under some specifiable set of conditions, they could be psychological conditions, epistemic conditions, certain types of normative conditions, all rational agents would in principle converge on the same intuition. So if you're appropriately psychologically situated to consider a particular philosophical position under the right circumstances, everyone in principle would have the same intuition with respect to that proposition. Now, if that's what they're saying, I don't know why, like, where are they saying that? I mean, there's probably a few articles. One thing you'll find that's a little strange about philosophical practice is it's not like a psychological study where if someone's running a study, they'll tell you, we use this paradigm. It was adapted from, this particular paper published in 1982 by these and these authors. You could go look at it. You could see the specific methods that are being proposed. You could look at the measures. You could look at the statistics. There is a somewhat, if not, it's rarely perfect, but there's a formal process of what's being proposed and how it's being proposed. Now, are psychologists always clear about what mechanisms they're claiming are driving the things that they end up measuring, like the outcome variables that they're looking at? No, psychology has a long way to go, but they're at least trying to be clear. When philosophers are talking about these sorts of things, it's so unclear what the underlying methodology is that there is ongoing dispute currently about whether philosophers even use intuitions. Now, that's a very unusual position for philosophers to claim that they don't use intuitions, but if they do use intuitions, okay, what are these? How do they work? Do they all rely on the same psychological systems or different systems? If they do rely, regardless of what the answer to that question is, which psychological systems are involved? How do they work? Are these the output of general psychological systems, or do we have specialized systems just like we have parts of the brain that are specialized for processing visual stimuli, auditory stimuli? Do we have a philosophy lobe? I very much doubt it. So if this is drawing on distinctive regions of the brain, how do they function? How do they work? What actually is driving the outputs of these systems? I mean, philosophers are basically working with a psychological black box that they don't even want to look at and see how it functions. And I find that really, really weird. It's like looking at the output of a computer program, and that's all you ever do is work with the output of a program. You input questions, you get your output, and you have no idea how the program works, what is going on in the internal programming of it. Is it giving you reliable answers? Maybe you just like the answers. But the thing is, and that's how you judge that they're true. The problem is that the output for the human mind, if you like the answers, it seems true, that's also output of the human mind. So you could both get bullshit as your output and the feeling that the bullshit has got to be true. And you wouldn't know the difference. So, I mean, a part of the problem is that we're working from within the system itself. And the only way we have for evaluating the system is to use the system. So we have a serious problem here, psychologically speaking, and I think philosophers just have not grappled with it. Now, what philosophers will then do is they just don't specify whose intuitions they're talking about, and they have this option, the possibility that they don't do that. They don't say this particular population finds it intuitive because they're imagining some idealistic conditions under which everyone would have the intuition. The thing is, even if they were proposing that were the case, that's an empirical question. It's an empirical question whether under some specifiable set of circumstances, people would converge on the same intuitions. Now, one can stipulate. So here's the problem with that. What a philosopher could do is they say, no, I'm not talking about I'm not trying to describe actual human psychology. I'm stipulating the conditions under which people would have intuition, so to speak. So suppose, for instance, someone said, look, in order to have a properly philosophical intuition, one would have to meet criteria XYZ in order to have a philosophical intuition. And among those criteria, one simply stipulates that in order for something to qualify as a philosophical intuition, it has to be the thing for which all rational agents under those conditions would have the intuition. Okay, so if that's the case, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily attempting to describe human psychology. You are stipulating a possible psychology, possible way agents could reason. But we could then ask a question, which is that how human brains work? Do humans reason that way? Because if they don't, then the conclusion wouldn't be that there could not be philosophical intuitions, like, we would not empirically study, there couldn't be. Maybe we could design an AI that could have intuitions under those conditions. But if human brains can't do that, for instance, imagine you say, just to simplify this, someone said a properly reflective philosophical intuition is an intuition a person has only when they're exempt from pragmatic influences on their judgment. So this would be something similar to what Koppinen proposes in the 2007 paper, The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy. Now, suppose human psychology is constituted in such a way that we're psychologically incapable of considering pure semantic considerations. It's possible, for instance, that the semantic pragmatic distinction breaks down, that the way that language works just isn't one in which there is a sort of a way in which one can analyze the meaning of words and phrases and sentences independently of pragmatic considerations. It could be that context is necessary for meaning. And so the conditions that are proposed under which a person would have a properly reflective intuition are actually impossible because they're presupposing features of the way that language works that are false, like as a matter of empirically, like that's just not how language works. In that case, no one would ever have a reflective intuition. And so if philosophy is supposed to function on us considering the outputs of these reflective intuitions, and they're literally psychologically impossible for anybody to have, then a philosophy that's making that presumption that this is what a reflective intuition is, and those reflective intuitions are necessary to drive that approach to philosophy, that approach to philosophy can't get off the ground. It doesn't work. So I don't think there's any way around, you can't just stipulate facts about human psychology. You can't just stipulate what is the case. You could stipulate a conditional claim about, given if this is the case and these implications will follow. You could stipulate if this exists, but you can't stipulate what is the case. And so I don't see how philosophers can get around this problem of being clear on characterizing what they're talking about when they're talking about intuitions, and in some way offering something that can integrate itself with or interface with human psychology in some way, or else we're not talking about something that we can be clear that anyone is doing or is capable of doing, or at least capable of doing under ordinary circumstances. And that's underselling the severity of the problem, because I think philosophers already take themselves to be doing philosophy and having intuitions of the relevant kind without us having virtually any understanding of the underlying psychology of what's going on here. They just don't know what they don't know what's going on. They don't know what these outputs are. I think a lot of philosophers might just not consider that relevant. But there's a deeper issue here. And the deeper issue is this presumption that philosophers have that they can generalize from the way they think about a philosophical issue to the way that other people think about that same philosophical issue. So what I've done in this first 30 minutes is I've raised some of my concerns about what the subject matter even is, what an intuition is, what exactly we're talking about, this sort of thing. But that's not even really getting into the meat of what I bring up in this article. So let me talk about what I bring up in this article. So what I say is that, a lot of philosophers will say that certain sorts of things aren't just intuitive. They'll say most people think that, or they'll say it's the common sense view. And the key example I routinely give is many philosophers believe, or they'll claim, that most people think moral realism is intuitive, or they have intuitions that are consistent with realism. They might characterize this in a variety of ways. Perhaps the most common way, or at least one of the most common ways, is to say that the way that people speak when they talk about morality and they express moral judgments is best explained by an implicit commitment to a realist semantics about those sorts of assertions, about moral assertions or moral claims. And the way that works is you would take an example case like murder is wrong, and you would say, okay, well, what do we take people to mean when they make this claim? And both realists and error theorists will say that we take people to be attempting to describe some autonomous realm of objective moral facts, or attempting to describe stance-independent moral facts, or refer to stance-independent moral facts. They're making assertions that are truth-apt, and what makes them true doesn't depend on the standards or values of people or of individuals groups. It's stance-independent and it's a fact. So that a lot of philosophers would say that is the common sense view. And that is starting to move into the realm of being, it's hard to see that as not being an empirical claim about human psychology. And, when you ask, when I've posed this question to philosophers about this, I've gotten a mixed response, but the question is basically, there's this component that is central to many metaethical positions. In fact, all of the major metaethical positions relevant to realism and anti-realism, which is realism on the one hand is a cognitivist position that treats moral claims as truth-apt, but the anti-realist positions are typically characterized in terms of a semantic claim as well. So non-cognitivism, you could say non-cognitivism is the claim that moral statements are not truth-apt. You could add the metaphysical claim, and that there are no objective moral facts. Morality just isn't in the business of attempting to assert any kinds of facts at all, objective, relative, whatever. But notice that what's central to non-cognitivism is the semantic claim about the meaning of moral statements. Then you have error theory. Error theory is, I think, one where it's especially unclear how it could possibly not be an empirical claim. And if you look at what J.L. Mackie said when characterizing error theory, I read the quote last week. I don't want to dig it up right now, but Mackie says something like, when people make moral claims, they mean to say something objective. That's hard to characterize as anything other than an empirical claim about the communicative intent of the speaker. That, as a matter of psychological fact, when people are making these assertions, their intention is to describe an objective moral reality. In any case, error theory, the whole point of error theory is that people are trying to do that, but they're failing to refer to anything that really exists. Kind of like sincere unicorn talk. If people go around saying, unicorns are awesome, unicorns are the best, well, unicorns don't exist, so those claims are false. Or, if someone's trying to describe dragons or ghosts, whatever it is that we take it that doesn't exist, statements about that aren't expressions of emotions. They're false because they're presupposing things exist and it doesn't exist. Hard to see how that's not an empirical description. And then finally, you have relativism. And a lot of, relativism holds that moral claims are true or false relative to the standards of individuals or groups. It could be relativized to something else in principle, but typically it's individuals or groups. And, again, in that case, one of the most, the common objections to that are, that's not how people talk. Or if relativism were true, we couldn't make sense of people having moral disagreements. If when I said, let's take individual subjectivism. So individual subjectivism is the view that moral claims are true or false relative to the standards of individuals. So I have one set of moral standards, you have one set of moral standards. When I say murder is wrong, it's true or false relative to my standards. If you say murder is wrong, it's true or false relative to your standards. And our standards could in principle differ, and then that would allow for something to be true according to my standards and false according to yours, or vice versa. So it allows for variable truth values of moral claims where they are indexed to the standards of the person making the claim. That's individual subjectivism. And so a common objection to these sorts of accounts is, well, if when I was going around saying murder is wrong and you were going around saying murder is wrong, and let's take something that we would plausibly disagree about. Murder, most people are going to say that it's wrong, at least most people that I would encounter, maybe there's some population where people don't think that. But I don't know. I don't like to get into super controversial issues, but let's just say there's a person that thinks lying is not wrong, and then I say lying is wrong, just to pick one. And of course, I would think that some cases lying is permissible, some cases it isn't. Lying for personal gain. Let's say we meet an egoist and they say lying for personal gain is okay. Okay, so I say lying for personal gain is wrong. They say lying for personal gain is not wrong. And so we have this difference of belief about that. If you think individual subjectivism is true, and critically, individual subjectivism is characterized as a semantic thesis about what I'm trying to say and what other people are trying to say when they make moral claims, then we could translate these claims. And it would look like this. If normally if you have the two people having a discussion, it's not okay to lie for personal gain. Yes, it is. Let's argue about it. Oh, well, it does this. Oh, it causes harm. Oh, you have a responsibility not to deceive other people, and you get a debate. And it seems like, we might say, it seems like you're disputing what's true. Now, I actually disagree with that. Just a quick point on that. People can argue about and dispute things without arguing about what's true. Just imagine a group of people arguing about what pizza toppings to get. They don't have to think that there's a fact of the matter. All there has to be is some practical consideration about which people are trying to coordinate action. So when two people disagree on what price to set on a product, like they're bartering or they're arguing over the price, they're negotiating a deal, they don't have to think there's a fact of the matter. They could both say, yeah, I have my interest, you have your interest, let's find a deal we both agree to. So they're trying to reach a sort of intersubjective equilibrium in the trade-offs that they're willing to make. They're not disputing what's true. And the same thing could be implicitly happening in a lot of moral disputes where people are trying to coordinate action. But a lot of times people don't look to be doing that. So maybe it looks like they're having disputes about what's true. Now, if you're an individual subjectivist, this would look like, instead of one person saying X is wrong and another person saying X is not wrong, or X is actually totally good, and then fighting about it, it would look like I'm saying lying for personal gain is inconsistent with my moral standards. And then someone comes along and says, well, lying for personal gain is not inconsistent with my moral standards. Okay, so what is there to dispute? What's the argument? It'd be like if I said, I like chocolate cake, and then someone goes, well, I don't like chocolate cake. What is there to argue about? And so one of these objections is that we couldn't make sense of moral disagreement if people were relativists, because they wouldn't be disagreeing. We couldn't make sense of disagreement. Well, that only makes sense in the context of us understanding like ordinary speakers when they're using moral language to be implicitly using it or even explicitly using it in a way consistent with individual subjectivism. And so again, that kind of objection seems to implicitly presuppose we're making empirical claims about what speakers are doing when they're making moral claims. So all of the standard metaethical positions about realism and anti-realism are characterized in a way that looks suspiciously like it's making empirical claims. It appears to be making, at the very least, we could say these accounts typically rely on a semantic thesis. The semantic thesis offers an account of the meaning of moral statements. And then when we consider that, we have a couple considerations. One is one I talked about last week, is it could be that the conception of language implicit in these accounts is one where they're not trying to make an empirical claim, but rather they think facts about the meaning of the sentences or terms in question can be known a priori. They can be known from the armchair. They're not empirical questions. And that the sentences and phrases and language in question have a meaning independent of speaker intent. It's not a matter of human psychology what this language means. Now, if that's the case, I don't even know what to say about that. I don't think that language works that way. That would be a whole separate issue. But if they are making empirical claims, then we face a pretty significant problem, which is that when philosophers make these sorts of claims, let's set aside that first issue and let's just run with the following claim. All major standard meta-ethical positions rely on an empirical claim about what ordinary people, non-philosophers, mean when they make. So ordinary people is just one of these common terms you'll see in the literature. I prefer the term non-philosopher. I think it's clearer and more descriptive. Ordinary is an unusual term. You'll also see a lot of the experimental philosophy use the term folk. I don't like the terms folk and ordinary. I don't think they're descriptive. I don't think they're clear. I don't think they're useful. I prefer the term non-philosopher. And that roughly means someone without significant academic training in philosophy. I don't know that if you watch my videos, do you become a philosopher? I don't know. And so really this is a kind of, it's a standard thing in philosophy where, some things exist along continuums and there's no sharp dividing line, and there are no precise cutoff points where a person is or isn't a philosopher. Even if a person's getting training in philosophy, at what point in the training did they become a philosopher and they're no longer a non-philosopher? 2 weeks of class, after they finish the first textbook, after they do their first exam, after they do 3 exams? What if the exams are 4 questions shorter than another exam? So there's not going to be any sharp cutoffs here. Anyway, so you have this distinction between philosophers and non-philosophers. I take all standard accounts in metaethics. So we could divide that into 5: moral non-naturalist realism, moral naturalist realism, moral error theory, moral non-cognitivism, and moral relativism. Those would be the sort of standard 5. You could throw constructivism in there somewhere, but there's different types of constructivism. And some of them might be realist, some might not be. Divine command theory, some of those might be realist, some of them might not be. So there's a few things that are left out. I'm leaving out like teleological accounts that maybe they'd fall under some naturalist account, but maybe they wouldn't. So there's different ways of characterizing different philosophical positions. Even the dividing line between naturalist and non-naturalist accounts might get strange for some positions. And then even within these positions, there might be subdivisions within subdivisions. Not all types of naturalism are going to be the same as one another. Not all types of non-naturalism are going to be the same. Not all types of non-cognitivism are going to be the same. So there's all these subdivisions and categories. I'm not trying to make any sharp dividing lines. This is crudely, there are these 5 main categories. Now, I don't fall into with any of those categories. It's something I've discussed before. But the point here is that all 5 of those standard categories look to me like they're making empirical claims about what people mean in everyday circumstances, what non-philosophers mean when they're making moral claims. So the problem is that philosophers will often make claims like, we think this, and they're alluding to some sort of claim about what most or all or what everybody means sometimes. And so I think that there's lots of specific reasons why we should be very, very skeptical of these claims. Let me actually stop before I get into that and see what some people have said. All right. So isn't this exactly how people argue about taste? It sounds like a disagreement about objective goodness of foods, but on reflection, it's almost never that. Yeah, so that's the thing. I don't think it sounds that way. I think a lot of the reasons why when philosophers look at are considering moral disagreements, they say that they sound like disagreements in a realist sense. I think that's a theory driven presumption about like what would an argument that doesn't presuppose realism sound like, you know. I have arguments about moral considerations all the time, and I'm not a realist. If you listened to those conversations, someone like, okay, let's just say someone entered halfway through a conversation I was having about some moral issue. They might look at that dispute and go, wow, Lance is really passionately arguing for or against some moral issue. It would be hard to make sense of this without presupposing realism. I don't think that that's true at all. I could pause and explain in unnecessarily tedious amounts of detail how nothing I'm saying in any way is presupposing realism. In fact, the presumption that normative moral disputes presuppose realism is often so ingrained in the way that people characterize this that they'll actually try to insist that I am on some level presupposing realism. I am not. I am not presupposing realism. When I have disputes about people, about moral issues, I have a position on how I want the world to be. I want there to be less suffering in the world. I don't want people to suffer and die in horrible ways. I want people to be happy. And when I'm arguing with people, I'm arguing with respect to the goal of trying to achieve the outcomes I want to see in the world. I want the world to be a way. And when I'm arguing with people, I want them to share my perspective on the way the world is. I will argue with people about which TV shows are good, which movies are good, what music is good. None of that is underwritten by the presumption that there are facts about what movies or TV shows or the way the world should be that people should agree to independent of their goals or values. What I'm often trying to do is to invite people to share, reconsider, hey, given your own values, really think about your own values. Isn't this consistent with your values? Wouldn't you like the world to be this way? Here would be a case. Often you'll have people say that they wouldn't want to make use of life extension technologies. They'd say, that's not the natural human lifespan. I wouldn't want to live to such and such an age. Now, if I'm arguing with someone about this, I might say, I would want to live to 150. I might want to live to 500 years old. Sometimes the reason why a person disagrees is because they genuinely just don't share the same standards or values as me. Now, if I know the person very well and I already know that, or it comes out in discussion that they're like, look, I understand your point of view, but I don't value the same things you do. End of discussion. I'm not going to keep fighting with the person. But I might initially think, maybe they're not thinking about the scenario the way that I am. And I might say, well, hold up. Now, before you just say I wouldn't want to live to 150, what are you imagining? Are you imagining having a very unpleasant experience where your health deteriorates until you're just, really unhealthy all the time, and you're like constantly doing all these medical treatments to keep your body working? And then they're like, yeah, that's what I'm imagining. That would be very unpleasant. And I go, okay, now hold up. Now imagine a scenario where you just stop. In fact, whatever age they are, let's just pick an age you like, where you feel the best, or you prefer to be that age. Say, for me, maybe I pick like 25 or something. And you take pills or you do a procedure, and then you just stay that age for 200 years or 150 years or whatever. And so you don't have those health problems. In fact, ordinarily, you're already going to have various health problems. Let's just suppose we eliminate all your health problems and you just live for a very long period of time. Now, would you want to live that long? And at that point, someone might say, oh, well, in that case, yeah, sure. But other people might go, no, it's not about health. It's about, I don't want to live that long for various other reasons. And then they might provide those reasons. So the point of having these sorts of disputes is sometimes there are factual disagreements, or you're thinking about different sorts of scenarios. So if I'm arguing with people, often I might suspect that the outcome that I'm thinking would be good, or I think they should agree with. The reason we're disagreeing about it is because there's some disagreement over some unrelated, well, I shouldn't say unrelated. It's not a fundamental dispute. It's a dispute like we're thinking about the issue differently. We disagree about what the relevant facts surrounding the issue are. So a lot of my disputes are an attempt to get a person to adopt my perspective and change their mind about the issue. And often some elements of that are, in fact, it's almost inescapable. Some of those elements are going to be normative or valuative considerations about what I think would be good or bad. And I just think maybe they would think it's good or bad if they thought about it the same way I did. I'm not supposing that good or bad has to be true objectively. It's intersubjective. So I'm very puzzled at this presumption that a dispute has to be presuming objectivism. Here's one very obvious case where two people could be arguing about something, and it's definitely not a matter of objectivism. Imagine that two people are cultural relativists, and they're both committed to the view that an action is morally right or wrong relative to a particular cultural framework. So, relative to this culture, an action is wrong, relative to that culture, it's not wrong. Now just imagine they're both members of the same culture. So now they're presupposing that they're arguing within the same moral framework, and one of them says X is wrong and one of them says X is not wrong. It's entirely possible that people aren't entirely sure exactly what, because it might be murky to people. What exactly does their culture think of things? It's not like we have immediate introspective access to what our culture thinks. That's vague. Often people seem to mischaracterize relativism. Cultural relativism is the view that moral rightness or wrongness is determined by what the majority of people think in a particular culture. It doesn't have to be determined that way. It could be, someone could say it's right or wrong relative to the standards of the culture, but that leaves underspecified how one determines how the standard, like what the culture standards are. What exactly does that mean? Now, you could take that as a mark against cultural relativism, but that's just a sort of general characterization of cultural relativism. A person that's actually defending the view could say, look, here's what I mean by this. And then they could flesh that out and make it more a more sophisticated and complicated account. In any case, you might not know what the majority of your culture thinks about a particular issue. So even if we ran with that, if we ran with that one, two people could say, well, I think 60% of people think X, and if they think it is wrong. And then another person could go, no, it's not 60%. Recent surveys show that it actually dropped to 30% over the past 20 years. So you're wrong. It's no longer that way. And our culture no longer does approve of that. So in that case, two people can have a dispute. They are both explicitly committed to an anti-realist position. They're both arguing about what's morally right or wrong, and they're presupposing a shared moral framework that they're both relativizing their claims to. So, there you go. That looks to me to be like a uncontroversial, undeniable case in which a moral disagreement could occur where there is no reason to think that the people are presupposing realism. And so if we can give that, that's a kind of proof of principle that it's certainly possible for people to have moral disagreements without the presumption of realism. I don't know why philosophers seem so convinced that disagreements must presuppose realist standards. Honestly, I think it's because most of them are realists, and so they just have trouble imagining how people couldn't think like they do. I think that that's a lot of what's going on a lot of the times. I routinely get incredulity at me being a moral anti-realist. I think people react with the mistaken presumption that I couldn't possibly care about things. Why would I argue about anything? Why would I be morally motivated? Well, I'm not indifferent to what food I eat. Does that mean I have to be a gastronomic realist? And then, I'll stop on that point. Someone has to write a paper about this if it hasn't already been written. There is this tendency for when you make comparisons for people to think that you're comparing things along some other respect. So you could give some example where, you say, oh, okay, well, if Kant made this argument, what would be wrong with me using the same kind of argument? Well, it'd probably be terrible because Kant didn't present any particularly good arguments. But let's just say you do that. So someone says, your argument isn't a good argument. No credible philosopher would use it. You go, well, don't you think Kant is a credible figure? Kant used the argument. And then, all you're doing there is notice what you're doing. You're just saying, hey, you're objecting that this is not an argument that a credible philosopher would make. But if you think Kant is a credible philosopher and Kant made this kind of argument, then it would be inconsistent with your claim that no credible person would make this claim or would present this kind of argument, because now you think a credible person did present this argument. So you're wrong. Here's how someone might respond to that. Oh, so you're comparing yourself to Kant. You think you're just as important as Kant. You think you're as influential in philosophy as Kant. That's ridiculous. It's incredibly arrogant of you. This is so common. And I'm sure most of you who are listening to this have encountered this in disagreements or disputes or arguments or whatever, where someone will make a comparison and then the other person will react in this way where they'll say that comparison is outlandish. What's going on here? The problem is that when you make a comparison between two things, often what you're doing is you're comparing them along a single dimension. You're saying, hey, these two things that are different, they're similar in this particular respect. But then often what people will do is that they will infer that you are implying that they're similar in other respects or in some broad and general sense. So if you compare yourself to some important historical figure or some great person or something like that, and you say, well, they were born in this place and I was born in this place, or they did this thing and I did this thing, people might mistakenly infer that you're saying, I am as historically as important as this person, or I'm just as great as this person, or I'm just as smart as this person. And often people will challenge a comparison by inferring that you're comparing it along other dimensions. That's not how comparisons work. When you're comparing things along one dimension, you're not implying anything about the other characteristics of the way in which they're similar or dissimilar. Anyway, okay, so back to what I talk about here. So here's a big issue with philosophers generalizing from the armchair, with philosophers saying it's common sense or most people have this intuition. Often, this practice of appealing to intuitions occurs within the framework of contemporary analytic philosophy by people that have been trained in the analytic philosophical tradition. Now, when people are doing that, when they're drawing on intuitions about how other people think, they're basically doing, we're granting that these are empirical claims. They're conceding that the claim in question, I shouldn't say conceding, that makes it seem like they're admitting something. No, not conceding. They're agreeing. They're like, yeah. When I say most people are moral realists or most people speak or think like moral realists, I am making an empirical claim. I'm making the empirical claim, like, for instance, they could operationalize it. I'm making the empirical claim that if you presented people with the proper type of thought experiment to prompt a realist intuition, that most people would say, yeah, I have the realist intuition and I think realism is true. You might say something like that. Now, the problem is that when philosophers make these claims, they are making psychological claims, and then they're not appealing in almost every case to any actual empirical evidence that would support the claim in question. They are often instead appealing to their own intuitions and their sort of anecdotal evidence, or their sort of loose memories of how, like, just their general experiences of the world. It'd be like if do most people prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream? Well, you could conduct it, or let's do one where what's one where it'd be more, I think most people prefer chocolate. What's one where the people would be evenly divided on the matter? I don't know. Do most people prefer lemons or limes? I have no idea if most people prefer lemons or limes. Okay, now, maybe people in the audience have an impression of what most people prefer. Anyway, so do most people prefer lemons or limes? Now, you can just appeal to your experiences. Well, most people I know, I think that they prefer lemons over limes. So I'm going to say most people prefer lemons. Now, how reliable are those judgments? I don't know. Probably not very reliable, because you're making claims about how people think based on your personal experiences. Well, your personal experiences they're going to be biased or limited in a bunch of ways. One is that you're going to rely on various cognitive heuristics. Information that's more memorable will tend to jump out at us. Information that is more consistent with what we desire to believe, so motivated reasoning, could influence us. But most importantly, when you're thinking about these experiences, the experiences of the people you've interacted with, even if you had perfect, reliable information about exactly what the limit or line preferences of everybody you've ever encountered where this came up, let's just imagine that, which wouldn't even be remotely plausible. Let's just imagine you have that. Are the people that you've interacted with representative of everyone in the world? And we shouldn't just say everyone in the world, everyone who has ever lived, because if you want to generalize to humans that exist is a different population than humans that exist or have existed. People in the past didn't necessarily, and almost certainly, in fact, didn't think exactly the same way that people that are alive today think. And most people existed in the past. So if you're going to generalize from your personal experiences of how people think to how everyone thinks, notice the barriers you have to cross. You don't know if your memories are accurate or reliable, because motivated reasoning and various other factors could influence your memory in a way where you don't even have accurate memory. You haven't gathered data in any sort of systematic and rigorous way. And even if you had gathered data in a systematic and rigorous way, I mean, if you actually went around with a clipboard and, every time you met a person, you said, lemon or lime, which do you prefer? And you checked off a box and you kept a big archive of it. That wouldn't even be remotely close, because there'd be, people might think, oh, well, what are they wanting me to say? I'll pick the thing they want me to say. So you might have to ensure anonymity and all sorts of stuff. There's also potentially factors influencing who you choose to ask. Maybe the people you ask aren't representative of the people that you don't ask, or the people that refuse to answer. So there's all sorts of representative issues. If you could get around all of those, the people that you happen to have asked are likely to have come from the same culture that you're in. And what we're starting to discover in social psychology, which I say starting to discover, but this should have been really plausible all along, is that the participants that typically participate in psychological research are not psychologically representative of people that currently exist in the world. So of course we can't even do psychological research on people in the distant past because there's no way to conduct that research. So that's already a population that we can't access with any of our current psychological paradigms. But the problem is that most psychological research is done on two types of populations: people in weird cultures and college students. So most research is conducted on people from, WEIRD is an acronym from Hinrich and colleagues that stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. Now, that is an acronym used to describe the countries of the participants. It doesn't necessarily mean that every participant in all of these studies meets these criteria. It's just that the vast majority of research is conducted in particular populations where people tend to come from particular cultures, and they tend to come from these weird cultures: Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So most of this research is done in, for instance, the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and there's comparatively far less research in other cultures and populations around the world. There's not as much research in Africa. There's not as much research in South America. There's not as much research in Asia. There's not as much research in all other parts of the world that I'm not even mentioning. It's just pretty much, it's mostly going to be the United States and the UK and some of, Western Europe, and probably primarily like Germany and France and a few other countries. So the research that we get comes from, almost all of that research comes from weird populations. But the weird populations make up, again, this is a case where there aren't clear and sharp categories, but they make up about 12% of the world's population, according to Hinrich and colleagues. And yet it's almost all of the research. So that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if you took that research in weird populations and you said, okay, well, let's conduct some studies in these populations and then conduct some studies in a bunch of different populations, a bunch of culturally distinct populations, and then compare the results across populations. Now, if you had this sort of distribution of traits and people from, say, let's just focus on the United States, because that's like the most common place for research to be done. Let's say you do research on participants in the US and then research on a bunch of participants from different cultures and countries all over the world, and you compare the results. Now, if people from the United States fell right in the middle of the distribution, or they tended to be kind of representative, there weren't huge differences. Like, let's just say there weren't big differences, or to the extent that there were differences, they were normally distributed, and people from the US are right in the middle. In those sorts of cases, we might think, okay, well, we can generalize roughly from people within the United States to people outside of the United States. That would be at least part of somewhat of a problem if there was a lot of variation and people from the United States, happen to be in the middle, because people at the poles of these distributions wouldn't be represented by people in the United States. So that would still be a problem. But we don't find either of those. For many of the psychological traits that were measured in this paper, I should pen the paper. Let me pull up the paper. And I really strongly recommend that people have a look. Well, yeah, I'll not bother with that. I just pen too many things. But check out their work. So there's growing research on these cultural differences too. In my interests in morality and other areas as well. Anyway, so the problem is that what they find in this work on weird populations is that people from, like, for instance, the United States tend to anchor one or the other extreme end of these distributions. In other words, for many of the traits that have been measured, if you looked at, say, 20 different populations and you look at the average score, you might get scores like this. Let's say it's a 1 to 10 scale. And you might get scores like 2.6, 3.1, 2.8, 3.7. So a bunch of scores sort of between 2 and 4. And then you look at people in the United States and they're an 8. So they're very unlike the rest of the population. So you have like 17, 18 populations that are all over the place, varying between, like, say, a 2 and a 4 or a 5 or whatever. And then people from the US are at the extreme other end of the distribution. And then you look at some other trait and people from the US have an average of like a 1.5. And then people from most other populations are somewhere between like a 6 and a 9 on some particular trait, or a 6 and a 10 or something like that. And so again, it's like you see this distribution, and then people from the United States are over here, or you flip it, you see a distribution and people from the United States are on the other side. So what Henrik and colleagues have found is that people from the United States tend to be very different psychologically along many measured dimensions from people from other populations. Now, here's the problem. Most of the philosophers that are engaged in contemporary analytic philosophy tend to come from weird cultures. They work, and so they tend to, let's just say, a big chunk, it might be the majority. If not the majority, it's like the modal or the most common, are in the United States. They're trained in the United States. They're from the United States. They've studied specifically analytic philosophy, largely from people in the United States, or from the United States, or from the UK, the Anglophone world, basically. So Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So what you get is that, philosophers are in particular populations. They've mostly encountered people within these populations, but it goes further than that. So already we could say that the populations where most psychological research are done are psychological outliers that are not representative of the rest of the world's population. That already creates a problem, which is that if you're conducting empirical research on people in the United States, you can't necessarily, and you shouldn't just presume to generalize, from your findings to the rest of the world. Now, there's probably some psychological traits that are shared around the world. And it could turn out to be true that if you test a population in the US and then you go test in a bunch of other cultures, you get something pretty similar. And so people in the US are representative with respect to that particular thing. You could certainly do this for trivial questions like, really basic food preferences, like preferring savory food over like really disgusting stuff. Like we could pick a food most people like, I don't know, French fries or pizza versus garbage or something like that. It wouldn't be surprising if you gave people all over the world inedible stuff that obviously nobody's going to like, and then you give them pizza. Not everybody everywhere is going to like pizza to the same extent, but on average, most populations are going to prefer, the kinds of foods humans generally like over stuff that humans don't typically, it's not even edible, So you could have really basic claims that could generalize to every culture. And then there's going to be maybe some surprising or interesting or substantive claims that also generalize. And then you're going to have a whole lot of characteristics that don't generalize from the US to the rest of the world. The thing is, in any given case, it's an empirical question whether or not it would generalize. So already, most of our research is on a population that is an outlier psychologically with respect to the rest of the world along a bunch of dimensions. And so we can't just comfortably assume that any particular thing we measure among participants in the US will generalize to people outside of the US. So that's already a problem. Now, you take how philosophers think about things. Philosophers are not even gathering systematic empirical data within the United States. They're just thinking about their memory of their experiences of people almost exclusively in the United States. Now, this isn't true of every philosopher about everything all the time. I'm just talking about the majority of philosophers, if you were to survey them, that are analytic philosophers working within the United States, which was, I think, most of the philosophers for the Phil Papers survey. So not only that, but you also have what you could call like the mind projection fallacy or the typical mind fallacy. This is a tendency to disproportionately presuppose that the way that you think is the way that other people think, or you could invert that and say it's the bias of thinking other people think the same way that you do. And so you actually haven't gathered any systematic empirical data at all. You're just imagining how other people think. And then you're thinking, okay, well, I think this way, so other people think that way. You don't have to formally think through that process, but well, I think this, so other people think that way. And this is what I think a lot of philosophers are doing. Now, the problem is that not only are philosophers, a disproportionate number of philosophers tend to come from a psychological outlier with respect to the rest of the world's populations. These philosophers then train on a shared canon, a shared set of texts that are, you could almost say, a distillation of the type of thinking that exemplifies, like they're like taking a bunch of Western thinking and they're just reading it and reading it, reading it, reading it, reading it. And it's not just that it's Western, it's also that it's a shared body of thinking. So philosophers all end up reading Kant and reading Descartes and reading Hume and reading the same work as they read Socrates and Aristotle and Plato. So you take all these philosophers that when they start out studying philosophy, they read the same stuff, they all talk to one another, they interact with one another, they create a subculture that is autonomous, very small, very insular. There's in fact empirical research showing that in other disciplines, they tend to cite one another more than philosophers cite other disciplines. So philosophers basically, they already come from a psychological outlier population on average. This isn't, again, it's not true of every single philosopher. I'm not trying to make a claim like that. I think that analytic philosophy is not only are philosophers, do they tend to be psychological outliers, but they also then induct themselves into a subculture that is even more distinct. And it's not just any old cultural difference. It's not like philosophers wear different clothing or cook different foods or produce different music. It's a subculture that the whole point is to change the way that you think. So if you're going to get a subculture that's psychologically an outlier with respect to the rest of the world's population, why wouldn't it be a discipline that's all about thinking in specific ways? And what do philosophers do? They study formal logic. They read particular ways of thinking. They learn to analyze arguments. So philosophers end up inducting themselves into an entirely distinct mode of thinking that is shared between them and not with other people outside of the discipline. And so these are people that have conditioned themselves to think very differently from other people. They are quite possibly the worst possible people to consult for having someone think about how other people think, because they very well might think the least like everybody else in the world. And so we're just going to take that philosophers' armchair psychology judgments about how other people think. And this is like, are we going to ask theoretical physicists that spend all day doing theoretical physicists how non-physicists think about physics? Are they going to know? I mean, maybe if they teach classes, but they might think, yeah, they don't think anything like me. But this isn't what philosophers do. Philosophers seem consistently to imagine, yeah, everybody thinks pretty much how we do. What? How do you know that? Wouldn't you have to conduct a study to find out? So you have this very unusual situation where philosophers generalize from the way they think to the way everybody else thinks, when we already have substantial empirical evidence which shows that we aren't even in a good position to generalize from psychological studies that are like, you could run a study with 1,000 people, well-designed study in the United States, and get really solid data how people think about some philosophical issue. You still can't generalize, because you don't know, if you ran that study in a different population, whether they would answer in the same way. And yet philosophers are just going to think about how people think about these things, and they're going to have reliable judgments? I don't think so. That's not even remotely plausible. So that is going to be a big issue. So let me go through the issues in the blog post that I point out. So you have issue 1, generalizing is difficult even with data. It's no easier without it. So that's one of the main points that I've just emphasized, that, we can't even do a good job of generalizing from studies in the US to studies outside the US with, no matter how rigorously we gather data. It's not going to be any easier to try to generalize from our personal experience in the United States to how people think outside the United States. So that's already a problem. The second problem is that generalizing based on experience and reflection is probably unreliable in many cases. So part of the reason for this, the main reason, is that your interactions with people won't even tend to have been representative of the populations that you're generalizing. So already psychological research, if you're conducting research and you get a representative sample of the US population, fair enough. You can generalize from your sample to the United States population. Now, a lot of psychological research in practice is not really achieving adequate representation, because they're often using college students. And I didn't mention that before, but college students, the way they think is not necessarily representative of the way that everyone else in the population college students are from thinks. It's very unlikely that they are. And note also, is it at all plausible that if you surveyed college students about philosophical questions, that they would think exactly the same way as non-college students, like children, people that are not in college, populations in their 50s or 60s? It's very unlikely. And by, college students, I specifically mean undergraduates. Some studies have graduate students. That's less common. In any case, you already have that problem. So the problem is that philosophers are not even getting representative samples of the populations that they could at best generalize to, were they to have representative samples, for instance, of people from the United States. They are, for instance, running informal polls in philosophy classrooms. Well, are students in philosophy classrooms representative of people outside of philosophy classrooms? I very much doubt it. You're not randomly assigning people to take philosophy classes or not. People self-select into philosophy classes. A second problem, when philosophers pose these questions, they're not posing anonymous surveys where careful work has gone into constructing the wording of the question in a way where it doesn't bias people towards one answer or another. When philosophers conduct informal polls, students can have background information about what the philosopher thinks, and this could cause demand characteristics. So people might want to give the philosopher the answer that they want. They often conduct informal polls in a classroom where students raise their hands. They're not anonymous, they're in front of other students. And so social desirability could influence how they respond to the questions. So these are basic issues that you attempt to minimize in well-conducted psychological research. You try to minimize the degree to which participants have a motivation to respond in a way that would be good for their reputation or make them look good. You don't want, if you want to get an honest and accurate answer from your participants, you don't want to make it the case where there's an asymmetry where giving one answer over another would make the person look worse, or make the person look stupid, or make the person feel bad, or make the person embarrass themselves, or make the person admit to doing something bad. Or there's all sorts of reasons why you don't want an asymmetry in the responses that people are motivated to give for reasons unrelated to it simply being an expression of their view. If you want to know, do they think A or B, you can't have appended to, if they say A, they're going to look like a jerk, and if they say B, they're going to look great, because you're going to get some people that's going to be sufficient to push them over the threshold and shift over to reporting B instead of A without it accurately reflecting their view. And now you have a biased measure that's misrepresenting the amount of people that favor A and B. You're getting a larger number of people that think B over A. Does that mean you have no measure at all? No, but you have an inaccurate measure. And that's just one factor. Social desirability, demand characteristics. They might try to give the professor the answer that they want. And then also when the professors are raising these questions, they could frame them in biased ways. I mean, imagine if I ask this question: do you think it's not objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? Come on, show of hands. Who thinks that? Of course, you don't think the tone could discourage people. The person, I don't. You're mocking the response. The people that would raise their hand before they even do it. When philosophers pose informal questions, there's all these factors that are influencing. Another factor, if you're doing a show of hands and someone asks a question, and let's say you have an anti-realist attitude. You're in a classroom with 50 people. It's bright lights. Everybody's visible. Nobody raises their hand. Are you going to raise your hand? Well, I might. I don't know. But you're going to have, there is research on Asch conformity. If you're not familiar with this, the way that this research was done, bring people into a room. You have like a series of lines. They're of different lengths. And then you have the participants sit down, and you have 5 or 6 other people that are working for the researcher. And then the researcher says, okay, so tell me which line is the longest. Now, let's say there's lines A, B, and C, and line C is clearly the shortest, and line A and B are like the same length. I don't know the exact details of the study. It doesn't really matter for illustrative purposes. So anyway, so the 5 people that go before you, they're like, yeah, it's A. And you're thinking they're going, clearly C is shorter. What are they sitting? Am I at a weird angle? What's going on here? The second person, yeah, it's A. Third person, yeah, A is the longest line. And you're sitting there thinking, the shortest. And you're sitting there thinking, clearly C is there. I can see it. And so all 5 people are like, yeah, A is the shortest line. And so when it gets to you, some people might think, well, I don't want to look stupid, So there's a couple things that could be going on here. One of the things that could be going on is you think, I must be wrong. Clearly, if everyone else is seeing it, maybe I'm sitting at a weird angle relative to the picture of the lines, and maybe they're right. And so you come to believe, I can't trust my senses here. They must be right. If that many people are all agreeing, I'm going to pick A as well. Or you could think, I don't want to look foolish in front of other people and embarrass myself. I don't really think it's A, but I'll go ahead and say A, even though I don't think it. So when you ask questions around groups of people, that can influence them. And so all of this is to say that philosophers, when they're gathering their data, so to speak, they're not gathering it in a way that's systematic and rigorous and minimizes these sorts of influences on the way that the people that they're asking these questions to will respond. And so they're not getting they're not getting rigorous data. This is not good data that they have. So we already can't generalize with data very readily. You have to do the cross-cultural research. And then they're not even getting data about the populations that they're generalizing about. They're getting these highly curated and self-selected samples. And then on top of that, they're not gathering the data in a careful and systematic way. They're relying on their memory of their experiences. So you have that problem. So then you have this problem that it's not just that philosophers will report those experiences. They might also say, well, most of my colleagues think this particular way, or that sort of thing. Now, the problem with that is that philosophers will curate the kinds of experiences that they have. I'm not saying they consciously do this, but the kinds of events they attend tend to be disproportionately likely to be composed of people that study philosophy, think about philosophy, and that sort of thing. Okay, let me get into, and I'll finish up here. Let me see. I have a couple more of these points to make about generalization. So I see these remarks. Let's debate this stuff. Are you going to let people on this week? Unfortunately, not this week. I'm going to have to go in a few minutes. So I'm really sorry. This week, I just have to go. So I'm not going to be able to debate you this week. So maybe another time. I'm going to be doing this every week. So, I already am sometimes a little worried that if I keep repeating a lot of the same stuff, it's going to get stale. What I can say is that my intention in probably about a month or two is to start rolling out a variety of distinct content. And I'm going to start making much more of an active effort to bring people onto the channel to discuss things. I may, in the next month, bring people on to discuss things to some limited extent, but I'm just going to start doing a lot more of bringing guests onto the show to talk to people. I really think that I can't just keep repeating the same metaphilosophical points over and over. There's lots of stuff I have yet to talk about. So one of the things I'm going to start doing is bringing other people on the channel. I also am intending to do a few other types of content. One of them is I'm going to start talking more about empirical stuff and moral psychology. So I'm going to talk about that. One of the things I want to do is I want to start bringing up the specific arguments that realists present for moral realism and then talking about how I respond to them. Other things I want to do is like a meta discourse or like a meta dialectic, you could say, is I want to talk about how to talk about philosophy. So I tend to talk about and engage in philosophical disputes in a way that's a little different. I get a lot more meta and methodological. I think that's an important but not a necessary element of philosophical disputes. So I'm going to talk more about that. I do have some new articles coming up, and I'm really happy with a couple of ones that came out recently. So I have all kinds of stuff that I'll be talking about. I'm still just kind of getting through the blog content, which I think I got about a month more to go with that before we start diving into the new stuff. So I think it's gonna get really cool pretty soon. So yeah, all right. So let's get through the last of these, and then I'll have to wrap things up. Right. So we do have some special cases of this sort of thing where we can demonstrate that that the presumptions that philosophers have made are probably mistaken. And for me, the big case is the case of moral realism. So a lot of philosophers seem to have presupposed that most people are moral realists, or they say it's the common sense view, or they'll treat it as this just sort of given. And as you all know, I've talked about this so many times, but the empirical evidence really is not very strong. So one of the most influential studies in this line of research goes back to 2008, Goodwin and Darley. And what they found is that when they presented people with a variety, I'm getting a complaint. Last week you told me we're going to debate this week. Well, I think I did say that, didn't I? I think I may have said that. I think I might have ran out of time, and I also have to go. So I might have just burned into our time this week. So if so, I'm really sorry about that. Let me go check and see if I would have. What is it that you want to talk about anyway? I don't have any objection. It's just I think I have to go in a few minutes, so we just won't be able to. I don't want to keep putting you off every week though, so that creates kind of a problem. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, unfortunately, I'm going to have to close out the stream now. So I'm really sorry. I have stuff to take care of in the house. I will see you all later, and I'm really sorry about that. Take care.